Dawn in Nanjing, China's last surviving communist commune. On the surface, a time warp, complete with revolutionary posters and radio news piped into the main square. But the community claims it rediscovered Marx's values as a defense against China's roaring capitalism. London's financial centre, Marx is unexpectedly being rediscovered here as well.
And all Marx and Engels' warning over the dangers of monopoly capitalism and concentrated finance have come to pass.
And we thought he was gone forever.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism, that system of government was consigned to the dustbin of history, and Marx was thrown out along with it.
So is it possible that we misread Marx? Is it possible that his insight into 19th century capitalism has more relevance now than in past decades? Karl Marx house in Trier, Germany, besieged by Chinese tourists.
Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the Rhineland, which is the westernmost province of Prussia. It was an interesting part of the Greater Germany because it had been occupied by Napoleon. And so it had been initiated in the ideas of the French Enlightenment. And that was the milieu in which he was raised.
I can feel no regret, wrote a young woman to her loved one. I shut my eyes very tightly. Once again, I lay close to your heart, drunk with love and joy. A romantic love letter like so many others. The innocence of the early 19th century in a provincial German town. The only difference is that the man the letter was addressed to was Karl Marx.
In Trier, he met Jenny von Westphalen. She was quite a catch for Marx because he was the son of a Jewish lawyer and was by such a social outcast. She was the daughter of a Prussian baron.
So he got educated in Trier and then he went to Berlin. I guess the expectation was that he'd go to college and be a good boy and learn law or something like that. He was politically very much engaged because there were always this kind of question of after the French Revolution, would there be sort of liberal democracy? What was going to happen to the autocratic regimes in Germany and so on. So he was kind of mixed up in all of that.
More than a century later, the romantic student from Trier had been transformed into the menace of Western governments and capitalist countries.
Captain Capitalism!
Ah, making out the old Christmas list, I see. Let's see here. World peace, an end to world hunger, free health care. This isn't a Christmas list, son. Who the hell taught you this, child?
Santa did.
Marx had become a boogeyman, the conspirator behind every social demand.
That red suit gives you away, Carl.
Captain Capitalism! So, you discovered my plan. Santa Claus is truly I, Karl Marx, the undead founder of communism.
The reason for this radical transformation from a promising young student into a dangerous revolutionary can be found in the basement of the Trier Museum, kept in a safe.
Das ist das Originalmanifest der Kommunistischen Partei von 1848.
In that year, Europe erupted in popular revolts. It was the moment Marx had been waiting for after years of agitating for radical political reforms. A specter is haunting Europe, opens the Communist Manifesto. The specter of communism. All the powers of Europe have entered into holy alliance to exorcise this specter.
Unfortunately for Marx, he was always late in all of his writing, and he didn't publish the Communist Manifesto until after the 1848 revolts had begun. So he couldn't take credit for those. But in fact, the Communist Manifesto was sort of lost in the revolution and was only rediscovered later.
The story behind the Communist Manifesto did not begin in the 1848 revolution, but in Paris 5 years earlier, when Marx met Friedrich Engels, the revolutionary son of a wealthy industrialist.
They met at a Paris cafe that was known worldwide as being a place where chess masters matched wits. Marx and Engels spent 10 days and 10 nights talking, and at the end of that time, they came out feeling that they were completely in agreement in all things. And the beautiful relationship was born.
Marx meeting Engels was, I think, a crucial moment. He met somebody who was actually engaged in working in the factories of Manchester and therefore could talk to Marx about the labor process.
They are worse slaves than the Negroes in America, wrote Engels, for they are more sharply watched, and yet it is demanded of them that they shall live like human beings, shall think and feel like men. This they can do only under glowing hatred towards their oppressors, which degrades them as machines.
Marx went to Manchester with Engels for a little trip in 1845. He saw the people who were living in the most degraded conditions, who were building this industrial future by working in the factories. He saw the families that had been torn apart by the factory work, the mothers who had to give their infants opium in the morning so that they could go off to work and assume that the children were going to be drugged all day and they wouldn't have to be cared for. For a man like Marx, a social and political theorist and an economic theorist, to go there would be to walk right in the laboratory of humanity, of industrial humanity.
While in 1848 the Communist Manifesto was ignored, in 1917 it was the blueprint for the Bolshevik Revolution and its global ambition.
Ever hear of Karl Marx? In his mind, communism was born more than 100 years ago.
Marx has now been transformed into a global threat.
This is the Kremlin, citadel of Russian communism. Looking closer, we see a public display of giant portraits of communist leaders. Here was a new face, but in the background was an old one, Karl Marx.
The Marx that people in the 20th century and the 21st century ran away from was Marx of the Communist Manifesto. That's the person that I think capitalist governments and democracies and Western governments held up as the person who was responsible for communism and its atrocities in the 20th century.
So maybe we got it all wrong. We focused so much on the revolutionary message of the Communist Manifesto and ignored the bulk of the document, which analyzed the real revolution that Marx wrote about, capitalism.
Ladies and gentlemen, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were the first to chart the uncompromising, unrelenting, compulsively iconoclastic nature of capitalism. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interests, than callous cash payments. And it was Marx who revealed how capitalism would crush languages, cultures, traditions, even nations in its wake. In one word, it creates a world after its own image, he wrote. I would like to suggest to you that Marx has rarely seemed more relevant. Marx's stock resurges on a 150-year tip was how the New York Times marked the 150th anniversary of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. A text which more than any other, as they put it, recognized the unstoppable wealth-creating power of capitalism, predicted it would conquer the world, and warned that this inevitable globalization of national economies and cultures would have divisive and painful consequences.
After the publication of the Communist Manifesto, Marx was expelled from continental Europe. He was once again a refugee, this time arriving in London in 1849.
Imagine Dean Street in 1850, the year Karl Marx and his family moved into this Soho neighborhood. The streets were teeming with refugees, people who had fled failed revolts on the continent. They arrived in this country, some with only the clothes on their backs, many not even speaking the language. Marx and his family were among the lucky, but all they had, 3 adults and 3 children, were 2 rooms and an attic. And in those cramped quarters, Marx tried to make sense of what he had just experienced and what he saw on the streets around him.
And next door, a brand new exhibition opened right at the time Marx began writing Das Kapital, an exhibition celebrating the achievements of the Industrial Revolution.
It was a triumph of industry. Man's greatest achievements were on display. And so this was the dawn of a new era. King capitalism was on the throne. And yet Marx up in his garret was busily scribbling why the system would never work. Yes, it produced wonders, but it would also produce great destruction.